Hi guys, it's me Grace coming from my office this time to have a discussion with you about the myth of the greatest generation. So I've had a lot of students I think misunderstand what I was trying to say in the PowerPoint and think that I'm giving an anti-veteran message. I'm not, so I just wanted to share some of the research behind where this idea comes from with historians. So just a note, I'm not the first historian to say this. Okay, so most of the Greatest Generation, that title, we didn't start using it until relatively recently, but a lot of its origin depends on the Vietnam War era. But the actual title, The Greatest Generation, comes from a book that journalist Tom Brokaw wrote, where he argued that the World War II generation was better than any other generation in American history because of a few things. They served with distinction, they answered the call of duty in a time of great evil, which was Hitler, that they went into it knowingly, and that they established the best economic system since as a result of their sacrifice. So, what I was trying to do in the class was claim that a lot of those are not true about an entire generation. To say that is discounting all the things that that entire generation did that wasn't very good, and it also downplays the role that minorities or other people, their perspectives and their experiences in that World War II generation. So I just wanted to address a little bit of this with you. The first thing with the myth of the greatest generation is that this idea that these Americans are the greatest that ever existed in any time period in history, greater than the founding fathers, greater than anybody else. By exalting them, we're downplaying the contribution of other generations who also did good things. So it's downplaying like current veterans, for example, who are fighting with distinction and honor overseas, or the Vietnam generation, or what about the founding fathers? Right? That's a generation that could be argued as being one of the greater ones. The other thing is by arguing that these people served with knowledge and distinction, we're also ignoring facts. Various surveys were done during World War II that asked the troops in the field why they were fighting, and the vast majority of them said, "We don't know," right? They weren't aware of what was happening with Hitler. They weren't fighting necessarily with a purpose. Most of them were drafted. And knowledge about the Holocaust and about what Hitler was doing was really restricted in the United States, to the point where a lot of people didn't know it was even going on until after the camps were liberated. We do know that the political leaders knew it was going on, but ordinary Americans, not so much, right? So that's more of a misunderstanding and a rewriting of history that happens post World War II, where we came in and we said this was a war that was fought for a great purpose. The vast majority of people didn't realize that when they were going into war. Also, to argue that they served with distinction and honor is to argue that they were exceptional to any other generation. And that was the point that was being used to criticize specifically the Vietnam generation for their protest and for draft dodging and everything that was happening there. But here's the thing, in World War II, there were draft dodgers. There were people who refused to go to war. They tried to get out of the draft. There were people who protested the war. And there were people who went because that's what they had to do, because that's what the draft was. So it's not particularly great at that time, in that there are normal people who do normal human things. Another thing about the war is that when we claim that they are perfect and that they're great, and we downplay the very bad things that that generation did, we are denying the perspective and the story of the minorities who were affected by it, right? So a great example of this are all the acts of racism that the United States participated in. The U.S. military was segregated. They prevented African Americans from getting positions as officers. They live in segregated units. It's as a result of the end of World War II in 1948 and the beginning of the Cold War that the American military was desegregated. Right? So all of the black troops that served in that war were regularly reinforced this idea that they are second-class citizens. And then we have the acts of racism against Japanese Americans being put in Japanese internment camps. And many of those Japanese Americans also served with distinction. And to say that what our government did to them was great, that's problematic. And then finally, even women within that system, right? And not being allowed to serve in full military positions. They served with distinction and honor, and to say that they had it equal is a misrepresentation. And the Rosie the Riveters and all the women who served in factories back on the home front, they had to deal with widespread sexual harassment and sexual assault. They were denied or mistreated by the men. There were a series of riots that happened when the men protested what was happening with the women, and then also with race riots over African American workers as well. So when I talk about the greatest generation and the myth that goes along with that, I'm not trying to downplay the contributions of veterans, and I'm not trying to bash veterans and what they do. I'm actually trying to draw attention to the discrimination that existed within that environment and not try to pass that off as being good and being great and being perfect. So I'm more intending to raise the voice of or the perspective of these other people and look at how they might view this particular generation. So we really can't call this generation the greatest when they participated in acts of violence and racism on the level that they did in the United States. To want to return to that time period is problematic because it really wasn't the greatest period. So I hope that clarifies some things for you. I hope that you understand the argument behind this. This is a historical argument that was presented by other historians. For future reference, if you want to find out more about this idea, some sources that you can look to, I have that I can give to you. Just send me an email and let me know. All right, guys, I'll talk to you later.